So I want to welcome everybody to tonight's program. This is the Minnie Feldman Memorial Lecture, which we are very fortunate to put on thanks to the children of Minnie Feldman. She was an advocate library user back through at least the 80s, maybe into the 90s, even before that. And I mean, like that's when I became aware of it, but her children, Myrna, Mark, Sari, and Robert Feldman, have supported this program, us having a program like this over the years. So thank you to them. I'm going to give you a little bio of Tony. Okay, it's not so little, but it's a bio. It's kind of extensive because he's a credentialed person. So I'm so thrilled to have him do an encore performance of this program that he did at the Middletown Thrall Library to share with you. Because I think if you weren't all interested in the election that's coming up, I think you will be more so after tonight. Tony is a retired educator who spent the bulk of his career at Middletown High School as a social studies instructor. He received his BA in history from John Carroll University in 1974, as well as dual certification in elementary and secondary education. In 1976, he completed his first Master of Arts degree in Soviet-American Relations from John Carroll's Institute of Soviet and Eastern European Studies. He later attended the Institute for the Study of Comparative Politics and Ideologies and received his advanced certificate from the University of Colorado in 1977. Tony was at Middletown High School from 1978 through 2008, and while in the Social Studies department taught international politics, futuristics, Russian Soviet studies, as well as AP US History and Global Studies. Tony received a second Master of Science degree in 2000 in instructional technology from the New York Institute of Technology and was the head of instructional technology at Monticello High School from 1998 to 2004. Oh, Middletown High School, sorry. He was an adjunct professor in instructional technology for the New York Institute of Technology from 2000 to 2014, and he now enjoys travel with his wife, Jan, who's here tonight with him, and doing occasional book talks and lectures at local libraries. So it's so great to have you, Tony. Now you can understand why this is going to be such an exceptional.
Thank you very much, Mary Grace. Hi, everyone, and thank you for that lovely introduction. It is great to be back up here at Monticello. This is always one of my favorite places. It's sort of almost home to come up and see everyone every summer, although we're a little later this year, calendar-wise, but given the events coming up next month, this is perfect timing. I want to simply draw your attention to our title page because essentially we're looking at three different themes for tonight's presentation. We're going to focus on the notion of when you're going to vote, to keep in mind the idea that character is destiny, that this is going to be a particularly unique civil rights election, and that we should always be particularly aware of the fact that we may, more than any time since the middle of the 19th century, be on the verge of approaching what some might fear is the emergence of a tyranny. So we'll go into that in a little bit. I want to thank the Feldman family and the Minnie Feldman Foundation for having me. And as I was speaking with Mary earlier, one of the daughters, Sari, and I may have even crossed paths because she was a librarian out in Cuyahoga, Ohio. And when I was doing my graduate work, I spent many, many hours in the Cuyahoga library system doing research. So who knows, perhaps our paths crossed. But our first couple of slides pay homage to the notion of how important libraries are in democracies as the cornerstone of democratic governments. This is a particularly astute quote by FDR, that if we maintain our library resources and a national intelligence capable of using them, that we can only strengthen our democracy. And likewise, nothing threatens authoritarianism like a quiet place to explore knowledge. And in truth, libraries save democracy. So we want to salute you as if you want to paraphrase the old Roman gladiatorial saying, "We who are about to vote salute you," to the librarians. So thank you very much. I'm going to start this evening actually a little differently than I generally do. And I normally finish a presentation with a suggested reading list and give you some ideas on where to go. But things got so involved in my last presentation that I actually didn't get to do as much as I wanted to do. And because of recent developments in the past week or two or three, as the tenor of this election season seems to be getting a little darker, I thought I wanted to make sure to key you into two very important resources. On the left is a history professor from Boston College named Heather Cox Richardson, who is absolutely a treasure, not just as a historian, but as a political observer. And she has a book out called Democracy Awakening, and the subtitle Notes on the State of America. But more importantly is a blog she has on Substack. And if you simply Google Heather Cox Richardson, and I have her on the suggested reading list, this is the URL that you would pump in to access her daily newsletter. And it is free. You can subscribe if you choose to, and with a subscription, you would get access to archives and things of that nature. But you can also simply have a free membership, and you get to read her every single day. And what makes her unique is that she brings a historian's perspective and commentary to everything that's happening on a daily basis. So she's an invaluable resource. On the other side is Timothy Snyder. He's a professor of history at Yale University. He has a new book out called On Freedom, which essentially covers the philosophical, political nature of freedom and the definitions and things of that sort. I chose, though, to highlight this one, the book called On Tyranny, because it's a very short book. It's less than 100 pages, I think, but it is incredibly important. It's 20 lessons from the 20th century on maintaining a democracy and preventing tyranny. And it is amazingly important for citizens to be aware of these lessons. He doesn't harangue, he simply presents a frame of reference that you will enjoy. And this is something that's easily shared with people, hopefully before they go to vote. So let's get started. That's my public announcement system. So what we're going to look at tonight, and we're going to start with very simply a foundational question, which is, how do you view the role of government, and who do you believe our democracy is meant to serve? So in a couple of weeks, unless you have early voting and you've already voted, or you're about to go and vote early, how we vote determines who wields power and authority. And the way this election is shaping up, there are two very, very clear directions and philosophies that you are going to choose from. And what I'm going to do tonight is explain which candidate represents which ideas to make it clear for you, if you had any questions going in, what is at stake. Who gets to define liberty and freedom? If you've been paying attention, you know that since the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the Democrats have made a concerted effort to own the term freedom. And it's giving notice to the American voters that freedom is something that needs to be considered and evaluated before you go in to vote. What we're going to look at today is, how does each party and candidate answer the question? Because political philosophers are very astute on this. One in particular from Oxford named Isaiah Berlin said, you have to be careful when you talk about liberty and freedom, because if you give liberty to the wolf, it doesn't mean freedom for the sheep. And we're going to see how Lincoln specifically handled the issues of liberty and freedom, and how that has evolved, and how it's being applied today, and what you might consider when you go to vote. How have the parties and their fundamental positions evolved? What I'm going to show you tonight is clearly this. Lincoln is very frequently cited when you go to Republican conferences or you hear Republican speeches, but we represent the party of Lincoln. You'll hear that phrase over and over again. So let's take a step back and see what was the party of Lincoln at its onset, when it was created. What did Lincoln actually believe, and where are those values today? Because as I'm going to show you, Lincoln had some issues that we're going to show the evolution of them and how they are still pretty much in the forefront today. And most importantly, do you know exactly who and what you're voting for and why? All of us probably know people who, when they are asked, who are you voting for, will say, well, I've always voted Democrat, or I've always voted Republican. So I just go in and pull the lever and that's it. Well, in this election in particular, that's not going to cut it. That's a very dangerous thing to do because the candidates and the parties have starkly unique, different perspectives of where America should be headed. And I love this particular quote: if you never change your mind, why have one? And that is something I try to pass on to friends who say, you know, well, I've always voted this way, or I've always voted that way. Well, things may have changed, and I think they need to be reconsidered. Anybody here a former history major by any chance? Oh, okay, I'm all alone. So now you all have to take the quiz at the end of the presentation. When you are a history major, one of the very first courses you take is in something called historiography, which means essentially you study the writing of history. Well, the skills and the things that they teach you about writing history are also applicable to analyzing politics and what you read and what you see in news. So these are some of the rules that I would suggest any citizen keep in mind during this election season. When you're seeing and coming across political information, you're watching ads or you're reading stuff online, first and foremost, identify the source and determine whether or not there is any bias or prejudice. We all know that if you log on or tune into Fox News, you are going to get a bias or a prejudice. If you do the same to MSNBC, you will get a different slant. There are myriad numbers of publications that range through the political spectrum. Secondly, determine the frame of reference and the context. Context is especially important because when we're looking at political advertisements, clearly you can have a candidate who is giving a talk, makes a comment off the cuff, and that 130-second bite becomes a framing ad for an opponent. So you need to make sure, we all need to make sure that we're aware of the frame of reference that is behind the message being conveyed. Whenever possible, use primary sources. Don't take a reporter's interpretation. Try to watch a video yourself. Try to listen to a talk. Try to find some kind of speech that gives you the verbatim text. Apply then a healthy dose of skepticism, but not cynicism. It's okay to be skeptical. Skeptical can be healthy when you're looking at documentation. Cynicism, not necessarily so much. And then most importantly, fact check. And later on in a few slides, I'm going to show you and refer to factcheck.org, which is on the back of the sheet that I handed out. I gave you some websites, and that's where you go if you have any questions. If there's a statistic you need, if there's a position that you want explained, or if you need some kind of information about a candidate, go to factcheck.org, and that gives you an unbiased source of information. Get out of your bubble, or another way is get out of your more comfortable echo chamber. Every day, I try and make sure I go through sources of news and information that I know are bizarre and they're not what I agree with. But it's important to see what's out there so that you can then measure it against something else. Just in case you're wondering, that good-looking person is Thucydides, who, even though he's not regarded necessarily as the father of history, he's regarded as the first objective historian, just for fun. Okay, What I like to do too is invite some guest commentators. And generally literary figures are fun to bring in. So we're going to start with William Faulkner. Now, if I asked you, how many of you, when you thought of the election of 2024, immediately thought of Abraham Lincoln? Probably not, or else you're a history teacher. Likewise, even if you were an English teacher, would you think of William Faulkner? Probably not. But for tonight's purposes, his quote is particularly appropriate. The past isn't dead. It isn't even past, because what I hope to show you is that if you start with Abraham Lincoln and the crises that he had to manage, we can look at him and how he did things and determine lessons to not only how he handled certain things, but to then use that as a comparison, as a blueprint to compare it to the current Republican candidate and the current Democratic candidate, and see how they measure up to what Lincoln did and how he approached various things. My second guest commentator is Amanda Gorman, who, if you recall from the Obama inauguration, she read a poem, which I always thought was neat because it reminded me of Robert Frost reading some poetry at JFK's inauguration. For our high school senior, yes, I was watching JFK's inauguration live. But anyway, Amanda Gorman came up with this quote, which I think really is something we want to remember, which is specifically, we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but it's simply unfinished. Our nation is a work in progress. Our democracy is never, ever done. It's constantly in need of nourishment and supervision and paying attention. So let's look at where we're headed. Election Day 2024, which is just 3 weeks from today, if you're not voting early. Are you prepared to preserve your freedoms and democracy? Now, interestingly, on the left, I chose March 4th, 1861. That's an actual photograph. No, I was not there. But what's unique is when you look at January 6th, 2021, an interesting parallel here. Notice, I want to draw your attention to that guy's sweatshirt, and notice he has the word liberty stretched across it. What happened on May 4th, 1861, is that President-elect Abraham Lincoln was on his way to Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated. But there was a challenge, and the challenge was he wasn't sure that the election was going to be successfully certified, because various Southern sympathizers had decided that they would throw as many roadblocks as possible into the certification of the election results. So lo and behold, when dawn broke on March 4th, the Capitol building was surrounded by the Army under the direction of General Winfield Scott, who was there to guarantee the transfer, the certification of the election and the transfer of power from James Buchanan to Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, he had the Capitol ringed with cannon. And he said, if anyone dare step on this property that isn't supposed to be here, I'll strap you to this cannon and distribute you as fertilizer across Washington, D.C. So that was the way the insurrection in 1861 was handled. Look at January 6th, 2021, and that's an insurrection that we desperately need not to forget. We need to be reminded of that constantly and keep our fingers crossed that there is no instant replay this January as well. We'll come back to this. So, election in 3 weeks, why would or why should you consider Abraham Lincoln? What does Lincoln possibly have to do with what we're going to decide in 3 weeks? Well, we're going to use him as a benchmark because he is very frequently cited by Republicans as the leader of, or their party is the party of Lincoln. And he gives us a roadmap because he had to manage a time period. And this is the title of a new book by Eric Larson called The Demon of Unrest. And that's exactly what Lincoln inherited. And he thought that the best way to handle an era of polarization was to rely on reason and rational conversation. And he was an evolutionary political mind. My antenna always go up when I hear the use of the word flip-flop or the terminology flip-flop, because frequently pundits will take a candidate and say, oh, well, in this context, you said this, now you're saying that, so obviously you flip-flopped. Well, yes, there are probably instances where you have a crass change of policy or tactic because you need to achieve a political objective. But in Lincoln's sense, it was the tactics evolved, but the values never changed. That's what the critical piece is. And that's what, as an educated voter, we need to pay attention to. So the question would be, what label would be appropriate to describe Lincoln today? There's a good question as to whether or not Lincoln would even be in the Republican Party today. We'll see as we go on. Here are some of the challenges facing Lincoln's Republican Party. As I just showed you, first and foremost, there was an insurrection. An insurrection first over the certification of the election, and then an insurrection over the issue of slavery. He had to, excuse me, reaffirm the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln was actually revolutionary. When you study the Lincoln presidency, American historians now go back and they focus on the Gettysburg Address. And they say for a 252-word speech, he actually recreated America because he brought the focus back from the Constitution to the Declaration of Independence. And most importantly, the notion of equality for all, as in the Declaration of Independence. He had to address the evil of slavery and minority oligarchs. He was fighting against the tyranny of the oligarchs, a minority of Southern slave owners that were essentially demanding that the government allow them to maintain their peculiar institution, or else they would destroy the Union. By the way, the next time you hear someone, primarily a Republican, criticize woke culture, here's just a little tidbit. On the right-hand side, after Lincoln had gotten the nomination for president, a bunch of groups, fan clubs, sprung up around the Northeast, especially in Boston. And these were groups of young men who were supporters of Abraham Lincoln, and they called themselves the Wide Awakes. So in reality, it was the Republican Party who started the entire notion of woke culture. But that's something that's a little known back there. He also, Lincoln also had to deal with some severe challenges. Excuse me here. He had to deal with a Supreme Court that up until recently had pretty much unanimously been regarded as the worst Supreme Court ever in American history, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, the gentleman on the left. What Lincoln tried to do, and unfortunately these didn't occur until after his death, was create and expand human, civil, and economic rights for all. These are referred to as the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The critical one for our purposes in 3 weeks is the 14th, because if you hear some rhetoric surrounding the notion of immigration and deportation, last I heard was that the Republican vice presidential candidate was talking about even deporting naturalized citizens. Well, if you've been to some of my speeches in the past and you kept the pocket constitution that I handed out, go back to the 14th Amendment and it shows you very clearly naturalized citizens are entitled to every right and privilege in the Constitution of the United States. So you just can't willy-nilly say, well, we're just going to deport naturalized citizens. This is the 14th Amendment. It doesn't work that way. He also, Lincoln that is, had to overcome the influence of the Supreme Court. The guy on the right is Dred Scott, who, according to this 1857 decision by the Supreme Court, it was determined that blacks were not citizens and had no rights whatsoever under the Declaration of Independence, nor under the Constitution. Dred Scott was not considered to be a citizen of the United States. Lincoln then wasn't around, but the Republicans had to deal with an 1876 disputed election where, and this was an interesting flip, the Republicans lost the popular vote, but were able to win the election when they convinced enough Southern states to throw their electoral votes behind the Republican candidate when he agreed to end Reconstruction. And the Democratic candidate, a guy named Tilden from New York, won the popular vote, but did not become president because of this corrupt bargain. So that it's just something to, it isn't a new, the notion of disputed elections isn't a new phenomenon. So how did Lincoln address the challenges and what lessons may be appropriate for today? These are some, this is a pretty scary photo. What Lincoln had to do, similar to what challenges we're facing today, is he had to counter the forces of states' rights. Now, we've heard a lot of states' rights, especially with regards to ex-President Trump talking about Roe v. Wade and how everybody wanted Roe v. Wade to be overturned or returned to the states for states' rights. Well, it's one thing to talk about that, but it's another thing for a woman traveling across state line to suddenly need medical care and have to determine whether or not the geography of that particular state allows her to have medical attention. In the 19th century, states' rights also broadened into the notion of nullification, where states would simply say, well, you know what? We'll ignore certain rights that the federal government or certain laws that the federal government is suggesting because the state should reign supreme over the federal government. And when that didn't work, he was left with the notion of secession. He had to deal with the myth of the lost cause, which grew up and sprung up immediately after the surrender of Confederate troops. The myth of the lost cause simply suggested that the South did not lose the war, that in fact, militarily, there may have been a cessation of conflict, but the lost cause continues. And the mythology of Confederate gentlemen and the almost the sacred nature, the religious background to slavery is something that continued. The KKK and what we face today, the notion of white Christian nationalism and the rise of white Christian nationalism, especially as it applies to immigration. And the whole immigration rhetoric that we're hearing has at its root white Christian nationalism. And then we also had the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. I'll talk about this later with the Supreme Court, the idea that separate facilities can be constitutional. It's going to be overturned by Brown v. Board of Education, but as long as you had separate facilities, Plessy v. Ferguson ruled that that was okay. Segregation was constitutional. So these are the challenges that came from Lincoln through the early part of the 20th century. So today, and when we go in to vote, we need to come up with a definition. And the definition is clearly, how do you define liberty? How do you define freedom? And this is a quote from Lincoln. This is something that isn't a new conversation. The world has never had a good definition of liberty, or the word liberty, and we are now in want of one. We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not at all mean the same thing. And interestingly, that's a photo of a bookshop down at the Jersey Shore, and the librarian is an outstanding person. She has a book, a table of banned books. Those are all titles that have in some capacity been banned somewhere in the United States. And when you look at the list or at that photo, I'm sure you'll all recognize. You've got Tom Sawyer of Mice and Men, Lord of the Flies, Handmaid's Tale, my textbook from High School of People's History of the United States. I can't read all the Native Son. These are Amanda Gorman's Book of Poetry is a banned book. Some would suggest that it's my liberty to have this book banned. Others would say, well, what happens to the people who want to read those books? That means that one person's liberty could be another person's tyranny. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself, as well as the product of his labor, while others use the word to mean that men can do as they please with other men and their labor. These are two not only different but incompatible things, but they're called liberty. It follows that each of the things is by respective parties called two different incompatible names, liberty and tyranny. So when you hear the two candidates talking about freedom and liberty, and the two political parties talking about liberty, one political party seems to be bent on restricting liberties and freedoms, while the other political party seems to be more in tune with expanding. And we'll see which is which clearly as we go on. So now let's look at some of the key issues that need to be considered before we go to vote. That, by the way, in the upper right-hand corner is a picture of the Supreme Court, and I'm pretty sure that was photoshopped to put the for sale sign there. I don't think that was there on the lawn, but it was a good photo to put in here. So the key issues, number one, voter integrity. And the whole debate surrounding registration, suppression, gerrymandering, vote certification, most importantly, the big lie. To this day, you cannot get the Republican or vice presidential candidate to say that the 2020 election was won by Joe Biden. That's the big lie. Integrity of the Supreme Court. We'll look at some of these Supreme Court cases and explain to you the significance of how they're going to play out in the election. This third issue is pretty much the whole ball game: women's reproductive health freedoms. If you are a woman, or if you have a wife, a daughter, a granddaughter, this becomes an absolutely, if not the most critical issue. Access to abortion and reproductive health care services, IVF treatments, birth control medication, overall health care. One political party is very clearly designed to restrict access. The other is meant to protect it. We'll see which is which in a second. The notion of domestic terrorism, we just saw 2 days ago, there is a white militant Christian nationalist just got arrested in North Carolina who said he was going FEMA hunting, primarily because of all of the disinformation that indicated that FEMA was not providing adequate aid to the people that had been suffering from the after effects of the floods in North Carolina. That's domestic terrorism. We have gun violence, Christian nationalism we'll come back to, as well as immigration bigotry. And then economic freedoms. Economic freedoms also boil down to opportunities. There are some states, primarily places like Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, that are actually eliminating child labor laws to make it easier for companies to hire younger children for more dangerous jobs. The rise of unions again and union support. Joe Biden was the first president to join a picket line. And we're going to spend a moment looking at the Democratic version and definition of an opportunity economy versus the Republican definition of what is called a neoliberal economy. And I'll make sure you understand the difference in each of those. There are education freedoms to be considered before we go to vote. The whole notion of what constitutes free speech, whether or not we want to accept the basic premise of book banning, and goodness knows curriculum interference, and whether we should be able to talk about slavery, whether we should be able to talk about the 1619 Project, whether we should be able to talk about genocide or the Holocaust, and whether or not it has historical significance or we don't want to make our children uncomfortable. Personal rights, LGBTQ and freedoms, trans freedoms, marriage equality, diversity, equity, inclusion programs. These are all ideas that both parties have specifically different philosophies on. We're going to spend a section on foreign policy. I would like to spend about 3 hours on foreign policy, but I think that would probably mean we'd have to stay over. The rise of autocracy and the fact that Donald Trump wants to be a strongman. The notion of environmental freedom. That means freedom to be safe. If you're living in Florida, if you're living in North Carolina and Georgia, suddenly climate change has reared. Let's put it this way, if you didn't believe in climate change and you're getting once in 1,000-year storms every 2 weeks, there's something that you need to consider. We'll look at technology threats, foreign disinformation campaigns. I have to be honest, we don't even have to worry about foreign disinformation campaigns so much as domestic. One political party is majoring in disinformation. And I like to differentiate between, and it might help you, disinformation and misinformation. Misinformation, I like to classify as information that gets out there as a mistake. Someone perhaps made an error, didn't quote something correctly, maybe put in the wrong statistic. That could be misinformation. Disinformation, because it starts with a D, is deliberate. It's misinformation, but it's deliberately misinformation for political gain or for some other reason. And then our two new oligarchs, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. We don't have to go to Russia because we did study this under Putin and saw the rise of oligarchs and what that means to basically dismantling a country. When you have Elon Musk running around as the richest person on the planet, suddenly weighing in and promoting disinformation on his X platform, or denying the Ukrainian army access to Starlink satellite technology, which would allow them to counter Russian aggression, then you've got a person who has an outsized political influence. We'll talk about that in a bit. So I've done the hard work for you. I went out and made sure that I read on the left the Democratic National Committee's platform, and on the right, which took a little more energy, I read the 2024 Republican platform. But you'll notice there's a second section to that graphic, which is called the 2025 Mandate for Leadership. That's Project 2025. So when the Republicans, or when you hear Republican candidates presenting their ideas, know that there are two particular sources. On the left, you have their platform, and we'll go through what the platform says, but the real details are in the 922-page Project 2025 dossier that is the Bible. That's their blueprint for what they will do on day one. And as Tim Walsh said, I believe at the Democratic Convention, you know, as an old coach, if you take the time to draw up a 922-page game plan, you're going to use it. And when you see what's in it, that will help you to very clearly decide where you want to go with your votes in 3 weeks. So let's look first at what the parties say about the economy, because traditionally the economy is one of the top 2 or 3 issues that voters always have. When you're a Republican, Your party economic philosophy was based on the writings of a guy named Milton Friedman. That's him up at the top. And he wrote the Bible for Republican economic philosophy called Capitalism and Freedom. It's supply side economics, and it's also known as trickle-down theory. And what that means, in essence, is that supply side economics means you make it easy for anyone who is at the top of the economic ladder, the owners, the managers, the people who have control of industries, and you give them as much money as you can, and you leave them alone. And then the wealth will trickle down to the bottom. That's essentially supply side economics, trickle down economics. It is also called neoliberalism. So when you hear the Republicans giving you their economic theory, or if you see mention made of neoliberal politics, it means trickle down economics, and it means fewer or no regulations. Milton Friedman coined the phrase unfettered capitalism, meaning have as few regulations as possible. 1980 to 2008 marked the end of what economists call the Great Compression. It's sort of ironic because when you see Trump flags, you'll see the phrase, "Make America Great Again." And if you ask those people, what does that mean? Many times you'll hear, oh, let's go back to the 50s, post-World War II, everybody was doing well. That's right. Everyone was doing well because that period from 1945 to 1980 is referred to as the Great Compression, when wealth was compressed into the middle. 1980, with the emergence of Ronald Reagan and supply side economics and trickle down theory, blew that out of the well and said, no, we don't think we want to do that with the middle class. Instead, we institute neoliberalism. This leads to increased economic inequality. If you were in the 45 to 1980 period, the Great Compression is when the middle class expanded. And there wasn't that much of a difference between the top bosses and the lower wage laborers. There was, you didn't have multiples of thousands in terms of difference in salaries. Now, notice at the bottom, I have an asterisk, leads to wealth redistribution. If you're neoliberal, if you're Milton Friedman advocate, if you believe in supply side economics, your income, your wealth redistribution did happen. It got redistributed up to the top. Now, the flip side is the democratic economic philosophy, which is a different approach. And while the Republicans had Milton Friedman write their Bible, John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian theory, you'll hear in economics, is the guy for this kind of approach. Keynesian economics promotes government intervention. Subsequently, for example, when the bottom fell out of the economy in 2008, there were all sorts of economists running around like with chickens with their heads chopped off because they didn't know what to do. And Barack Obama had a choice. Do you let the bottom fall out and have another depression, or do you have massive government intervention? Fast forward to 2020 and 2021, and we have a pandemic. And Joe Biden is looking at economy, a worldwide global meltdown, saying, what do we do? Do we just let the invisible hand take over, or do we have government intervention? That's what Keynesian economics means. The government steps in turbulent times to even the playing field. It's also referred to as progressive capitalism, and it focuses on building an economy from the middle class out. Now, notice again at the bottom, it leads to wealth redistribution. The difference is now the wealth is redistributed to the middle and the bottom. So there is your progressive capitalism. It's also referred to as compression capitalism. Same thing, this is Robert Reich, a great, great economist, in order to reduce inequality in the wealth gap. The most important ingredient in this philosophy is that you have a partnership. You have private-public partnerships. When you hear Republicans run around and they start using the S word, well, you're a socialist. With Trump, I love it because he hits everything. In one sentence, he can call you a socialist, a Marxist, a communist, and a fascist, all in one sentence, which means he has absolutely no idea what any of those mean. But private-public partnerships are what created the New Deal, for example. When you looked at many of the government programs, the alphabet programs that took place in the 30s and 40s, they were successful because they were both public monies and private enterprise together. But the state steps in and makes sure that all economic activity is law governed. If you want to scare a Republican economist, say the word regulations, because businessmen think they know best. And frequently, if they're talking about their business, they may know that's true. But business doesn't operate in a vacuum. As John Donne said, no man is an island. We have to have an acceptance of regulations to promote freedom for everyone. You give up some freedom to be part of the social contract. So now the Democratic platform, this is right from the Democratic Committee, is a bottom-up, middle-out economy. So we're going to use, and they're proposing, this is what Kamala Harris and Tim Walz would be suggesting: targeted use of tariffs, improved conditions for home ownership with tax incentives, lowering poverty rates, supporting expansion of Medicare coverage. The one idea she came out with last week was to help sandwich families that were caring for young people as well as elderly parents, and having Medicare be able to cover the cost of taking care of elderly parents in your home. Protecting consumer rights and privacy, and strengthen the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. What could you possibly not like about an organization that has consumer finance protection? That sounds like a pretty good thing for our citizens. And then address corporate concentration and fair profits with fairer tax codes and enforcement. And look at the quote from Ayn Rand: upper classes are a nation's past, the middle class is its future. And she was not by any stretch of the imagination a flaming liberal. So what Harris and the Democrats are proposing is to create an opportunity economy. And Joe Stiglitz, whose name was up there earlier, makes a good point that if you want to talk about freedom, you have to have economic freedom. You have to have economic stability. Because if you're poor, if you're destitute, you don't have opportunity. And if you don't have opportunity, you don't have freedom. Don't talk to the person who can't feed their family about their freedom. And that's what this is all about. So, and the good news is that Harris is able to run on this economic model. In the third quarter, GDP grew 3.2%. By the way, I don't know if any of you read The Economist or see the magazine The Economist. You can go online and read it for free up to certain paywalls. It's the major magazine in Europe, but they're doing an entire 7-part special feature on why the United States economy is the shining light globally right now. And they are a very conservative magazine traditionally. So this is not going unnoticed globally. We are far and away the leader in global economics right now. Reforming the tax code, protecting workers and families with child labor laws. No one has been stronger with the role of unions, raising wages. Wages have gone up, especially for lower wage incomes. Growth of small businesses. She's grown over 12 million small businesses since 2021. 16 million jobs, which is 6 million higher than the pandemic. Payroll rose 254,000 jobs last year. Unemployment is down to 4.1%. Inflation is 2.3%. Yearly wage growth has exceeded price growth for 15 months in a row. any of these statistics, if anyone gives you statistics or suggests them, say, well, let me go check it out. And then go to factcheck.org and they will use and show you all of the resources to find it. Now, what I've done here is this is the Republican platform. And I didn't make an error in terms of formatting this slide. When you read the Republican brochure and platform, everything is in caps, everything. And on the right, what I did was I played with a program where you pump in words and it'll tell you, it'll make a graphic representation based on the frequency in which the words appeared in a document. So I did that with this, with the Republican platform on the economy. So look at what word pops out as being the one that occurs most frequently. So if there you have basically the theme of regulation. So this is what is in the Republican platform. Cut costly and burdensome regulations. So tell that to the folks who are in Florida rebuilding and didn't have to worry about building codes or things of that sort. End inflation and make America affordable again. Well, inflation's down to 2.3. Make America the dominant energy producer in the world by far. We already are producing more oil and gas than any other country on the planet. Turning America into a manufacturing superpower, large tax cuts for workers and no tax on tips. Feed a family of 4 on no tax on tips. And then keep the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. But that is debatable because something was said a day or two ago that made people wonder whether Trump was talking about tanking the dollar. But they couldn't figure out exactly what he was talking about. This is a continuation. Republicans will reduce mortgage rates by slashing inflation. This is a good one. Take federal lands and allow for new home construction. This one is a key blank in Montana in the Senate race right now, because there is a Democratic incumbent senator named John Tester who's being challenged by a Republican who is saying, well, we're going to protect our federal lands, because in Montana, they don't want to hear about federal lands being given away. They like their federal lands. And so he's dancing around this one. Make Trump tax cuts permanent. Guess who those tax cuts benefit the most? Promote home ownership through tax incentives, cut unnecessary regulations. Now, on the right-hand side, this is verbatim. So I'll let you have it, but I will admit I have no idea what it means. And I've tried to decipher it because it changes. Because he wasn't for crypto a while ago. Republicans will end Democrats' unlawful and un-American crypto crackdown and oppose the creation of a central bank digital currency. And then we will defend the right to mine Bitcoin and ensure every American has the right to self-custody of their digital assets and transact free from government surveillance and control. Anybody here into Bitcoin? Okay, then we will go on to the next slide. All right, so here's fact check. So you've got the Democratic record and their philosophy, and you saw what the Republican platform held, and here are the final numbers. Under Trump, the economy lost 2.7 million jobs. Unemployment rate increased by 1.7% to 6.4. US trade deficit was the highest and increased 36%. Federal debt held by the public went up from 14 trillion to 21.6 trillion. Economists are saying if you buy the Harris economic plan, it will add roughly 3 trillion to the deficit, 4 trillion. If you use the Trump economic platform, it will add $7 to $8 trillion. It would double what the Democratic proposals are in terms of the deficit. Home prices rose, home ownership increased, but look at corporate profits. That's what the Milton Friedman supply side economics talks about. There's your unequal distribution of wealth. Coal production declined, coal mining jobs dropped, carbon emissions dropped commensurately. So those are your two side-by-side comparisons of economics. Now let's look at women's issues. And this is Lincoln again, in his wisdom, saying, I go for all sharing the privileges of government who assist in bearing its burdens, by no means excluding women, which was a pretty radical comment at the time. This is a pretty neat photo. It's a girl named Minnie Ream. She's one of the first, she is the first woman to have done a bust of Lincoln. She was only, I think, 15 or 16 when that photo was taken. And she is the only woman to have, I believe, a full-size statue of Lincoln in the Capitol building right now. And he made a point of hiring her because he had heard about her starting out. And he said, come in. And I don't normally sit for this, but there she is with the bust that she made of Lincoln before he was assassinated. So when you talk about women, this is the issue. 2022, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, otherwise known as the repeal of Roe v. Wade. So in overruling and eliminating the federal constitutional right to abortion, this decision allows states to severely restrict or ban abortion outright. Now, if you hear Trump, when asked about this, he said, everyone wanted to get rid of this. Well, I'm not sure that's correct. In 14 states right now, there are total bans on abortion, with very limited exceptions in cases such as rape or to save the life or health of the mother. A few more states, including Florida, just reinforced their 6-week ban. Another half dozen states have restrictions that limit abortion after various time periods. But one good note is that in June, the Supreme Court preserved access to the abortion medication, mifepristone. But guess what? It says in Project 2025, if the Republicans win the White House and Congress, that will be outlawed. It will be banned, along with abortion, but we'll get to that in a second. So now let's compare the platforms side by side, Democrats and Republicans. Democrats on women's rights. First and foremost, create a program for affordable, high-quality child care from birth until kindergarten, with most families paying $10 a day. Fight to make the Equal Rights Amendment the law of the land. It boggles the mind that it isn't still the law of the land. Democrats will pass the Paycheck Fairness Act and end pay inequity. You may have seen, I think just yesterday or the day before, Lilly Ledbetter passed away, who was the absolute pioneer, equal pay for women and men.
Is that Joe Biden's first? Didn't he sign something?
Obama.
Oh, Obama.
Obama was that was the first bill he signed, was the Lilly Ledbetter Act. Support Pregnant Workers Fairness Act to protect women's rights on the job and expand opportunities for women entrepreneurs and increase the small business loans to women-owned businesses by 70%. There is a huge focus on the Democratic side on creating small businesses. Small businesses are the engines that create middle-class jobs and middle-class wealth, especially women-operated small businesses. Now, the Republican platform on women. At Trump's GOP convention, there was very little to be heard on health care, only one mention of the word abortion in the entire convention, the whole week. Republicans changed the 2024 platform to reflect Trump's position opposing a federal abortion ban, but ceding limits to the states. Now, here is where you need to do your own research and digging. Up until the Republican convention, And for a very, very long period, Donald Trump and certainly J.D. Vance were calling for a national abortion ban. The closer we got to the Republican National Convention, suddenly that morphed and changed to, no, we'll give it to the states. Project 2025 states national abortion ban. Period. Trump appointed 3 of the 6 justices who voted to overturn Roe v. Wade. There, in the Republican platform, was no mention of women in the top 20 promises to voters. They had 2 pages, promises to voters, and in the top 20, the word women did not appear. So what would Lincoln think? He would go back and say, okay, so in 1999, Trump is pro-life. Interview with Chris Matthews, there has to be some sort of punishment. You know what? Didn't I correct that? In 1999, he was pro-choice. Excuse me. I thought I must have used I didn't change it on this version. 1999, Trump started out as pro-choice. 16 years later, in that infamous interview with Chris Matthews, there has to be some sort of punishment if a woman has an abortion. 2020, Roe v. Wade must be overturned. 2023, last year, he was celebrating, I was able to kill Roe v. Wade. Now we're leaving it to the states. Now, suddenly, they will also support IVF. That wasn't the case up until the Republican National Convention. So let's expand. We've done economics, we've done women. Let's look more broadly at some civil rights. Democrats support Respect for Marriage Act, enshrining marriage equality. Democrats extend federal non-discrimination protections, LGBTQ plus people. Democrats support civil rights in housing, employment, healthcare, education, and justice. Notice nothing's being taken away. This is expanding civil rights. Republican platform, let each state determine reproductive health options. So girls, when you're traveling across the country, call AAA and get a triptych, map it out so that you know what state you're in case you have any health difficulties with reproductive health. And then in caps, this is their civil rights stance: defend our Constitution, Bill of Rights, fundamental freedoms, including speech, religion, and right to keep and bear arms. I heard one commentator, though, gave a good description of the Republican definition of freedom of speech, which is Republicans are free to say what they want, and everyone else is free to accept what they hear from Republicans. That's the way that's their definition of freedom of speech. They're free to tell you what to think, and you're free to accept what they tell you to think. Keep men out of women's sports. That's worthy of a plank, I suppose. Then there's senior citizens. One political party here has a long, long, long history. And I know that you know from your history class and your participation in government class that it was Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats who created Social Security. Continue to fund Social Security and Medicare without reductions. This is the Democratic Party. Secure universal health care with a public option, and expand long-term care services and supports. That's what Kamala Harris was talking about with the expansion of Medicare. The Republicans have found Jesus, and now they're going to fight to protect Social Security and Medicare with no cuts, including changes to retirement. Go back to what I told you about being skeptical. The notion here is that going back to George W. Bush, one of the first things he wanted to do was privatize Social Security and put your Social Security in the stock market. That would have gone over really well in 2008. And also up until the Republican National Convention. These, by the way, you'll notice that Democrats will always talk about Social Security. Republicans will use the word entitlements. And there's a definitely distinct interpretation of those terms. Social Security means what we have invested in as a security for us as we age. Entitlements means, well, the government is sort of giving it to you and we can take it away if need be. And that's what you have there. And undercutting all of this is the Supreme Court. And this is my good friend Cicero. And once again, the notion of freedom. We are slaves of the law so that we may be able to be free. You've studied in participation in government. I hope your teacher talked about John Locke and the social contract and the idea that you need to give up certain rights so that the common good can be promoted and everyone's rights can be then protected. Otherwise, we'll be in a state of nature, which I think the Trump people are starting to describe. So when you look at the Supreme Court, you're going to hear about the Federalist Society. This is an organization in Washington, D.C. that is devoted to conservative ideologies. Those 6 Supreme Court justices were all members. When Trump became president, the first thing he did was tell Mitch McConnell, give me a list of Supreme Court justices, potential Supreme Court justices from the Federalist Society. That's where he took them. There are 6 conservative justices. Look at the stats. 8 presidential elections over the past 30 years, 8 Supreme Court vacancies. Republicans won the popular vote 1 time, but they have 5 of the 8 new justices. We're going to talk right now about tyranny of the minority. Now, a couple of things, and now we're going to go back to the evolution of political parties. And we want to take you to the middle of the 20th century. Relevant Supreme Court case, 1954, Brown v. versus Board of Education. Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren, unanimous. The civil rights case, state-sanctioned segregation of public schools was a violation of which amendment? The 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. On the left, in the center, he should look familiar. That's Thurgood Marshall, future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. So in 1954, what President Eisenhower thought was going to be a conservative Chief Justice in Earl Warren hands down a Supreme Court unanimous decision that says separate is unequal. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which we had mentioned. That's why I put that in there. So separate is inherently unequal. This gets followed up a decade later. Now, this is the critical piece, because in 1964, we have the Civil Rights Act. Remember, this is Lyndon Johnson, Democrat, Texas. Civil Rights Act declares no segregation in public places, discrimination based on race, gender, or national origin. Okay? The following year, 1965, is the Voting Rights Act. Everything we hear and read about today with regards to voter suppression, voter limitation, gerrymandering, can be pretty much traced back to right here. Congress adopted the law to ensure the 15th Amendment's guarantee that the right to vote not be denied because of race. Section 5 requires jurisdictions with a history of discrimination to obtain approval from the Department of Justice or a court before changing voting rules. It's called pre-clearance. You thought that was just when you go on airplanes. This is voting pre-clearance. Well, a couple of things. So what happens here is, in that photo, it's hard to make out, that's FDR signing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. When he signed that Voting Rights Act, he turned around and said specifically, I just made the South Republican for generations. Because remember, Lincoln, Republican, anti-slavery, it was then the solid South from 1865 to 1965. The South was solidly Democratic. From 1965, bing. And then it went on steroids in the 1970s with Richard Nixon, well, the late 60s, with Richard Nixon and the Southern strategy. And suddenly the Republican Party became the party of segregationists and white nationalists and things of that sort. Now, remember 65, 2010, Citizens United is passed. 5-4 majority said that corporations and other outside groups can spend unlimited money. And this was their proviso, as long as they're not formally coordinating with a political candidate. Formally coordinating, that's kind of funny. And that opens the floodgates to dark money. So now dark money runs our elections. But here's the kicker. Remember the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 said, if you're going to change the rules, you have to get pre-clearance. In 2013, Shelby County, the Supreme Court said the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional, or at least Section 5, under Congress's power to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. It reduced the authority of the Voting Rights Act to grant the national government the ability to review states' elections policies. So what that meant was, let's gerrymander. Let's just pack, and now it's called pack and crack. Pack and crack means when state legislatures look at a map and they see population distribution, they can see, okay, we've got a Black population that stretches over 3 jurisdictions here, 3 congressional districts. So we're going to crack them, we're going to separate them, and we're going to pack that into 1 congressional district. So let all those Black Democratic votes, but they only now vote on 1 legislative representative. We'll distribute those other legislative districts to the white Republican legislature. So that's why you have a state like North Carolina, where the Democrats got almost 3-to-1 majority in the popular vote in congressional districts, and the Republicans gained seats because of pack and crack, or crack and pack, excuse me. So what this did was basically open the door to that kind of gerrymandering. Now, there was one glimmer of hope last year, because Alabama went so far that even the Supreme Court said, you can't even do that. We can't even let you do this in terms of gerrymandering. They discriminated against African-American voters in such a blatant force that even the Supreme Court said, you've got to create an additional district here. It was irrational. And so similar cases are now being held in some of those other states. But then the Supreme Court came back. And now this is the kicker, and this is where you want to introduce the word tyranny. Because by this decision, a former US president has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority, and at least presumptive immunity for other official acts. For official acts outside, there is at least a presumptive immunity. In other words, no guardrails. None. 0 guardrails. So know that, for example, step 1, if Trump wins the election, all of the federal cases pending disappear because the Department of Justice is simply ordered to drop the case. Done. Gone. So the obstruction, the insurrection, all of the campaign finance, the voting interference, all those are gone. History, done, hands clean. Plus, now we have a clean slate with no guardrails because I have immunity. And it gets scarier in a second. So looking at the Supreme Court, the 9 justices are the only ones not bound by the Code of Conduct. Some would suggest, Richard Durbin there from Illinois, that the Supreme Court can be addressed and that they can create ethical law, ethics codes to essentially regulate and manage behavior and things of that sort, conflicts of interest. But more importantly, this is what the Democrats are proposing. They are proposing fixed terms for Supreme Court justices and a mandatory retirement age, We were just talking, Gordon, about 60. You're retiring at 60 from Ernst & Young or your daughter, and here the Supreme Court justices can go forever and ever and ever. Which leads us to this question. And this is something, this is why we're doing clickbait on polls and the Electoral College. Do we have a representative government? If we're worried about the Electoral College, how representative is our democracy? Our polarization, look at the statistics. In less than 20 years, 15, 16 years, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states. That's only 30 senators. Sparse rural areas have more power than dense urban centers. So, of course, you look, it's called flyover country. The Republicans control the red central part of America, the rural, and the Democrats are the blue coastal states, for the most part. That is a reflection of the geographic polarization. But what happens is then you've got Iowa. Well, let's go to this side. Each state, big and small, gets 2 senators. So look at the representatives, just do the arithmetic. California's 2 senators represent 39 million people. 39 million. Wyoming gets 581,000. It means the smallest 25 states have as much power as the 25 biggest. And when the founders created the Electoral College, they were under no illusions, and in fact, were clear that this was not to be democratic. They didn't want this to be democratic in the sense of every single person gets the vote, because they didn't trust the population, because they thought that the population, the general populace, would be prone to falling under the sway of demagogues and, individuals who had ulterior motives. So they wanted a small collection of intelligent political elite to be able to act as the electors of the president. Well, that backfired. And don't also forget that much of this was determined because of slavery. The southern states wanted to make sure that they cemented their power in the Electoral College. Now, one way to get around this that you're going to hear more about is the National Popular Vote Compact, because this is something that has potential for minimizing the impact of the Electoral College. It was introduced in 2006. This idea has been adopted by 17 states and the District of Columbia so far. And these jurisdictions represent 209 electoral votes. Remember, 270 is what is necessary to win. So the map shows you the blue states that are already in the national popular vote. So now what happens here is this. This is the premise. When these states sign in, they agree that they will award all their electoral votes to whichever presidential ticket wins the overall vote, the popular vote. So if, for example, this were in effect now, and let's say Kamala Harris wins the popular vote, all of these states, even if they had voted for Trump, would then take their electors and swing them over to Kamala Harris. It's designed to ensure that the candidate who receives the most votes nationwide is elected president. But here's the kicker. It would come into effect only when it would guarantee that outcome. So if it's not necessary, you don't have to worry about it. So if, for example, if Kamala wins the popular vote and the electoral vote, this is moot. Then the legislators wouldn't have to go back and reconsider the assignment of electoral votes. It simply means we're on board, and we'll make sure that whoever wins the popular vote wins the electoral college. So as far as voting is concerned, this is a clear choice. One party is expanding, the other party is constricting. Democratic proposals: enforce voting rights, help veterans, college students, Native Americans, and underserved communities register to vote. You're not going to see that in Project 2025 or the Republican platform. Expand voter registration programs to include automatic registration when renewing any state license. Any state license. I got a response, I don't understand why, in my last presentation, because I said you could do this at the Department of Motor Vehicle, when you get a hunting license, when you get a fishing license, anybody that's licensed, when you go to the barber shop, you could get registered to vote. That's what drew the laughter when I mentioned that I could go to the barber shop and get registered. Okay. Reduce the influence of special interests with new laws governing lobbyists, reform campaign finance, repeal Citizens United, and of course, make Washington the 51st state. Now, on the flip side of that coin, that's the Democratic proposal to expand democracy, secure our elections, including same-day voting, voter ID, paper ballots, proof of citizenship, and then once again, defend our Constitution, Bill of Rights, right to bear arms, freedom of speech. Okay, I think you got the idea. Republican voter suppression efforts. Since 2021, more than 425 bills restricting voting access have been introduced. This is not a party that is interested in expanding democracy. The bills are centered around limiting mail-in voting, strengthening voter ID, shortening early voting, eliminating automatic or same-day voter registration, curbing ballot drop boxes, and increase purging of voter rolls. Virginia and Florida just undertook massive voter purging in their states. Virginia did it. If you haven't voted in 3 years, they just wiped your name out. And good luck. If you haven't re-registered, you're going to show up and you're not going to vote. So we have a pretty clear contrast there. And then there's intervention. Republicans in 8 states have introduced bills that would give lawmakers greater power over election administration after they were unsuccessful to overturn. Today, just before we came in, a Georgia judge overruled or threw out a case by that crazy 3-person Georgia panel and said they cannot not certify the votes. So that when the votes are done in Georgia and they're canvassed and they're counted and it goes to the board, it's their constitutional responsibility to certify the votes. They were trying to get a window where, oh, we'll just, we're going to hold it up until we're satisfied. The judge says, no, there is no you're satisfied. When they come to your table, it's your constitutional duty, done, certified, out the door. And then there's immigration. So on the left, in caps, seal the border, stop the migrant invasion, stop the migrant crime epidemic, demolish foreign drug cartels, crush gang violence, and lock up violent offenders. Well, there is one candidate who has done that, who has experience dealing with felons, rather than the other one who is a felon, and then begin the largest deportation program in history. Okay, imagine. Now let's imagine, take 10 to 15 million people. How are you going to do that? Just the logistics of creating camps with either the National Guard and or the military and or law enforcement to go door to door to door to find people to throw into these camps, 10 to 15 million people. That was Stephen Miller, Trump's advisor's number. And what is that going to look like? On the other side, you have the Democrats who were basically the ones that had the bill ready to go that Trump had the Republicans in Congress vote against. It would have increased the number of agents as well as the technology on the border. It would reform the asylum system to make it more stringent. It would fight human trafficking, expand legal immigration pathways, because we are a country of legal immigration. Keep families together. I tried to find I should have put in a photo of the separation of families during the Trump administration. And finally, let dreamers and long-term undocumented residents have a path to citizenship. Once you get past immigration, unfortunately, it's blending into domestic terrorism with rhetoric such as white Christian nationalism. And this is where you heard or should have heard the conversation Trump had at an evangelical conference where he said to them, quote, "Vote for me and you won't ever need to vote again." He's not making that up. His premise very simply is there won't be another election. Or if there is another election, it'll be an election only in name only. It won't be something that we're accustomed to in terms of legitimate two parties. Technology threats with disinformation campaigns, artificial intelligence and the influence of Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. And the question is, when you have Elon Musk, do you have free speech or do you have tyranny of the minority? When Elon Musk could say to you or any of us, "I'm kicking you off of X, the former Twitter. We're not going to allow you because I have the freedom to say that's not what is American. And I'm not worried about your freedom. This is my freedom." So that's Zuckerberg and Musk and Trump. So now Lincoln actually had something to say about this, interestingly. And even though he was talking about slavery, it's the same premise of non-democracy. I hate it because it deprives our Republicans, small r, example of its just influence in the world. It enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity. Can you imagine? Does this sound like what was being discussed in the European Union right now or in the United Nations? Especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principle of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. Wow. And then we have freedom again from gun violence. When Trump went to the NRA, he bragged in February that he did nothing on guns. That's a quote. Meanwhile, gun violence spiked. He rolled back on safety requirements and repeatedly broke promises. This one is a no-brainer. Even the majority of NRA members want to have gun reform, but their leadership refuses to bring it up. Then we have a world-class education for every zip code. This is the Democratic platform. Ensuring education freedoms such as free speech and eliminating book banning, eliminate curriculum interference, relief from crushing college debts, which would then have a rollover effect into the economy and home ownership, make higher education affordable, and create environmental freedom with the Inflation Reduction Act promoting investment in clean energy and manufacturing. The gentleman at the bottom is Sean Fain, the president of the UAW. He has been a huge advocate for unions. As far as the Republican platform on education, now this is very specific, and this comes from Project 2025 also. They are promoting universal school choice. Remember, public education. Universal school choice. Support Moms for Liberty. That's that group that tries to promote religious instruction in public schools. Republicans will reinstate the 1776 Commission, which instills their version of American history, promote fair and patriotic civics education, and veto efforts to nationalize civics education. Restore the First Amendment right to pray and read the Bible in school. And here's a couple of items that are sure to get the teachers' attention. Let's support ending teacher teacher tenure, adopting merit pay, and what happened to the rest? I'm sorry. That got cut off. They want to end teacher tenure, adopt merit pay, and allow publicly supported educational funds to go to any type of school, so that when your tax dollars are paid into the pot, that means then that a Republican administration can say, well, we're not going to give much money to Monticello Public High School. Instead, we'll give it to the Donald J. Trump Charter School, which has a Donald J. Trump curriculum and so forth, such and so forth. And here is the really, really dangerous piece. And this is where we get into tyranny. The rise of strong men and oligarchs. That's a photo of Viktor Orban of Hungary, who is the poster child outside of Putin because he came up with the phrase illiberal democracy. He does not feel that democracy is a healthy thing. He feels that it is too tolerant, that it is not based enough on religion, and it should be focused on a homogeneous national population, and that the government has the right to regulate your gender, sexual activities or preferences, the schools you go to, et cetera, et cetera. When you deal with Putin, if Trump and Vance win, J.D. Vance has said, quote, I don't give a damn about Ukraine. Well, if you imagine and remember your history, in 1939, when Hitler took over Eastern Czechoslovakia, Western Czechoslovakia, the idea was that, well, we'll just give him breathing space. And that's where the notion of appeasement was born. Well, when you look at Ukraine, the world is watching what we do with Ukraine. If anyone thinks that Putin is going to simply stop at eastern piece of Ukraine, I don't know what more to tell you. Having spent my academic career studying totalitarian regimes, it's not going to end well for Europe. And then one of the things that comes out is the cult of personality. When Trump ran for president in 2020, and at the Republican National Convention, at one point in his speech, leaned into the camera and said, I know what's wrong with America, and I alone can fix this. It sent chills down my body because this was straight out of Stalin. This was totalitarian vernacular. This is dictatorial rhetoric. And then he is on top of that dismissing our allies in NATO. One of the most amazing historical accomplishments of the Biden administration has been the reinvigoration of NATO. And it gets little play for whatever reason, I don't know. It's maybe not that interesting to some people, but NATO is critical for maintaining peace in Europe. This is what we need to pay attention to. These are essentially the 5 steps to being a strong man. First, start with a lie. How about the big lie that I won in 2020? Then capture the courts, as in, let's control the Supreme Court and appoint all these federal judges to make sure that I can always shop for a federal judge to give me a decision I want. Consolidate power. The first thing that's mentioned in Project 2025 is to rewrite the Constitution to give the president what's called unitary executive privilege, meaning the president is going to have pretty much unlimited power. Promote kleptocracy, institute crony capitalism, hand out contracts to your friends, and politicize the notion of freedom. Talk about freedom, but remember that the definition of freedom has to be more than freedom is how I define it, because one man's freedom is another person's tyranny. If you give any president the freedom to do whatever they want, you end up with tyranny. So it then comes back to Project 2025. And this is what the Republicans are running away from desperately. And they don't want anyone to even mention it. 922-page document written by the Heritage Foundation, And it's meant to literally be the blueprint for day one. Here's what it says, and I'll summarize this because I know it's late and there's a lot here. First, it creates a unitary executive. Means basically we're going to give the president more power than the founding fathers ever envisioned. This is George Washington's worst nightmare come true. James Madison would be spinning in his grave. Secondly, we're going to take civil service and eliminate lifetime protections in civil service. We're going to make it a loyalty pledge, a loyalty oath to have a civil service job. These will be political partisans. They will be political hacks. We will, in fact, there was a story that said a number of Republican operatives involved in this have been filing Freedom of Information Acts to gather information on civil servants to see what their political affiliations are so that they can be the first ones to have their jobs terminated. It says we're going to eliminate the Department of Education and any funding for Head Start programs. Slash money for any kind of research on fossil fuel substitution, replacement that has to do with climate change. Withdraw that abortion pill from public consumption. And the last one, I don't know if the Republicans have read the fine print here, but they're going to ban pornography. I just throw that in because it's just a sample of how bizarre it is. So we're going to wrap it up by saying simply pay attention. This is a collection, probably just from the past few weeks, on what Trump has said, because there's a choice here. Quote, no, on when Sean Hannity asked him in an interview, are you really going to be a dictator? His response, no, other than day one. We're closing the border and we're drilling. After that, I'm not a dictator. Okay. On question about election denialism or election validity. In looking back at 2020, a massive fraud and magnitude of this type and magnitude allows for the termination of all rules, regulation, and articles, even those found in the Constitution. So if I don't like the way the election turns out, we'll just ignore the Constitution. Now, this is the scariest phrase from the past few days. I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within. Sick people, radical left lunatics, and it should be easily handled if necessary by the National Guard or if really necessary by the military. He just said that 2 days ago in an interview with Maria Bartiromo. Lastly, it has been determined that Google has illegally used a system of only revealing and displaying bad stories about Donald J. Trump. I will request their prosecution at maximum levels when I win the election and become president. So he'll prosecute Google along with Mark Zuckerberg, along with any Democrat that has disagreed with him in Congress, any former president, any political figure, just keep on going. And then essentially, Maya Angelou will wrap it up for us. When someone shows you who they are, what in the world happened here? This is what happens when you go from Apple to Windows. I'm sorry. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. That's her quote. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And then one last thing, just so there's a timeline. 3 weeks from today, we vote. By December 17th, the electors will then vote in their states. Christmas Day, the electoral votes arrive in the Senate. And also once that goes to the National Archives, that's a carryover from 1861 when they were afraid that the radicals in Congress were going to destroy the electoral ballots. So they then said, we're going to have multiple sets so that they get sent to the archives. January 6th, again, Congress counts the electoral votes, and fingers crossed that on January 20th, we have an inauguration. So let's leave you with some inspiration. This is Lincoln at Gettysburg. He's right in the middle with a top hat. Or no, he doesn't have a hat, but he's in the middle. The notion that at any new nation conceived in liberty is dedicated to the proposition, all men are created equal. But we're living in a time that's testing whether that nation can long endure. And we hope that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. And that wraps it up in time for questions and discussion.